She grew up with a family of strong women, particularly her mother and grandmother. She started her career playing in the famous Canadian coffee houses throughout Toronto and Montreal. She was one of the first in the Toronto Blues Society Women in Blues series at Toronto's Albert Hall. Her versatile voice has allowed her to sing such types of music as top 40 to disco, R&B, reggae, ska, and rock and blues. Her name is Heather Katz. She has performed with such musical legends as James Brown and Otis Clay. Heather has been amazing audiences for 3 decades with her 4-octave vocal range. With the recent release of her album, she is sure to amaze them for another 3. Join me, Melissa Morris, as I talk one-on-one with Heather Katz right after this break. Hi, and welcome to this edition of One-on-One. I'm your host, Melissa Morris. Thank you very much for joining us today. And joining us is singer and performer Heather Katz. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for asking me.
We have a lot to talk about, and I want to start right from the beginning. I understand that you grew up listening to a lot of big band music, and that you were raised by some pretty strong women, your mother and your grandmother in particular. Tell me a little bit about how their strength influenced you, not only musically, but in your life.
Well, the story of my grandmother coming to Canada was very strong in my upbringing. She escaped from Russia during the Russian Revolution, and she walked to Romania with 5 children and her sister. I grew up knowing that story, and so I grew up knowing that women could do anything. And when I was 4 years old, my grandmother moved into our house, so I had the influence of both my mother and my grandmother growing up. My father worked a lot and wasn't home an awful lot of the time. He was in the taxi business. And so my mother ran the household as well as working 2 jobs. She was a dressmaker, and she was a seamstress. She had an office in the basement where she would do clothing for people, and she also drove school bus in my early years. So I knew that, women could be an integral part of making money for the house, and whatever had to be done was able to be done. My mother had a very specific way of doing things. There was the wrong way, the right way, and her way, and that can be a blessing and a curse, but her way was usually very well thought out with a lot of experience, and usually in the long run ended up being the right way. In these years now, I'm even more so realizing that than I did in my 20s.
But did you feel that you had to kind of do it your way to learn that in the end?
Well, because of the artistic personality that I had, I was the most rebellious of the 3 daughters. Right. And so anything that my mother told me was her way, I did the complete opposite, and learned quite quickly that wasn't always the right way.
Tell me about your first musical experience as you remember it.
My very first musical experience would have been in school, in public school. We had music a lot back then, a lot more than you see in public schools now. And I remember music classes being something that was always very exciting for me. Mm-hmm. But when I was 6 years old, I went to an after-school program. It was a Hebrew school, and they had a choir, and I became part of the choir. And when I was about 10 years old, I went to a camp, and the counselors, several of the counselors were folk musicians of the time. And so there was always music happening at camp, and I decided I wanted to learn to play guitar. So that's when, for me, it became something that I knew was really important to me.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get your first guitar?
That's an amazing story. We were at the exhibition, and my mother was playing bingo while I was out on the rides. And when we came back, she showed us that she had won a first prize bingo, and there was a whole wall of prizes to choose from, and she was eyeing this really lovely 4-piece Corningware set, and just behind, hanging on the wall, was this guitar. And I said to her, I really want that guitar. And she looked at me, and she called the man over, and she said, we'll take the guitar.
Wow.
And Yeah, she eventually did get her Corningware, but it wasn't for many years. So I had this lovely guitar that was almost untunable, and I played it for 6 years.
Really? And you started playing in some pretty amazing venues, coffee houses all over the place. How did you get into that? Because you were quite young when you started.
My first professional job was at 17, but prior to that, in Toronto during the early 70s, they had several summers where they closed off Yonge Street. They called it the Yonge Street Mall, and it was closed off from Dundas to King Street. And when I was 15 years old, I went down there, and there was street music all over the place. And I thought, I can do this. I can play guitar. I can sing. So at 16, I took my guitar down onto the street and put my case out and just started singing. And people would throw money in, and that was my first paid gig. So it made me realize that, yes, people appreciated what I was doing. And at 17, I'd heard about this new coffee house opening called the Bohemian Embassy. And I phoned, and I spoke with the gentleman who was booking it, and told him that I was this up-and-coming new singer, and he needed to have me there. And so my very first contract was signed for $30 at the Bohemian Embassy. And after that, I just went around to places and said, I'd really like to play here, and they let me.
And you're one of the first women in the Toronto Blues Society Women in Blues series at Toronto's Albert Hall. How does it feel to be among that group of women?
It was funny because I was talking to Derek Andrews recently about that. He says, I don't remember that you were in that. I said, well, I was, Derek. It was probably before you called it the Women in Blues review. But it was great. It was myself, it was Liz Tilden, and somebody else, whom I don't remember off the top of my head. Albert's Hall was an amazing place to play because they supported blues music so vehemently, and some of the greatest acts that I've ever seen perform I saw there. Etta James was on that stage, and when I got on that stage, I remember thinking, Etta James sang here.
Yeah.
And it was amazing, and it was a very well supported review.
Yeah.
And so we had a full house every night.
And we'll be right back on One to hear more about Heather Katz's career and more when we come back. Welcome back to One, where today we are joined by singer and performer Heather Katz. Heather, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been fun talking to you about your career so far, and I want to kind of stay in the 70s and 80s right now and talk to you a little bit about what it was like back then. You were in cover bands that basically covered everything from reggae to ska to disco to R&B. What was it like performing sort of at the beginning, and did you have to go through any ups and downs?
There were a lot of ups and downs, particularly during the disco years. That wasn't always pretty. In the beginning, the very first band that I ever toured with was the Choker Campbell Band. It was called Choker Campbell and the Super Sounds, and that was in the late 70s. And Choker had at one time been the leader of the Motown Band in the early 60s. He was on the early recordings of Stevie Wonder, of the Supremes. And he was a real musician's musician. I mean, that's all he knew was music, and that's all he knew was how to travel and be on the road and almost work every single night of the week. And for a 22-year-old who, was for the first time being away from home, we played for a year without ever playing in Toronto.
Wow.
And I was on the road with 5 guys. So it was a real learning curve for me. I had to learn to be independent, to make friends in the towns that we were in, because I didn't have my regular circle of friends. I had an itinerary long enough in advance that I could write home and say, if you want to write to me, this is where to send it, 3 weeks from now. But I'll tell you, it was probably one of the best musical learning experiences of my life, because Choker had been, prior to Motown, had been with Lionel Hampton. So he'd been in the big band era, and then he'd crossed over and begun been in the beginning of the rock and roll era and the R&B era, and traveling with him was like traveling with a musical encyclopedia.
Really?
And he brought albums and his record player with us everywhere we went. So when we weren't working during the day, I'd be listening to Lester Young and Charlie Parker, and they weren't people that I was familiar with in the jazz era because we were so much used to hearing big band at home. So that was more Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman. But I really got turned on to jazz by working with Choker, even though that wasn't the music that we were performing. We were performing covers of the time, which at that time was mostly disco. I got to sing YMCA.
Lucky you.
Really.
And I mean, traveling with musicians like that must have, at 22 years old, shown you this kind of work ethic. I mean, what did you learn from a work standpoint from these people that, you know, it's not just about being on the road, but I mean, there's a real ethic there.
You know, there's a real ethic, there's a real drive. There's also a lot to be said for having a break.
Right.
You know, I remember one time, and this was so incredible. We were in Edmonton, Alberta, and our guitar player quit. Now, we were in the kind of band that wasn't a co-op band. Choker was the leader of the band, and we were paid a salary, and we worked for him. So when the guitar player quit, it was up to him to get a new guitar player. But according to union rules, that meant that if he took a guitar player from Edmonton, that he had to fly them back and forth to Edmonton when we were all in Toronto on a break.
Right.
So he didn't want to have to pay that airfare, so he decided he would get a musician from Toronto. So we drove from Edmonton back to Toronto, took 2 days to audition guitar players, picked one, and then our next gig was in Prince George, BC. And then we rehearsed him in the van on the 3-day drive to BC.
What an amazing way to see the country, though.
Yeah, through a very, very small window in the van.
That's great. We're going to come back to talking a little bit about your family later on, but you did take quite a long hiatus to raise your family, but in that time you were still involved with some organizations and were still doing benefit concerts. Tell us a little bit about who you were working with.
Well, when I first had my oldest daughter, who's now 18, several of my musician friends got involved with the Red Door Society in Toronto, which was a women's shelter in Etobicoke, and they would have a yearly benefit, and I would always get a call to do that, which I was happy to do. And also Child Find. Child Find was a benefit that I did yearly. My friend Virgil Scott organized that in Toronto, and I, you know, with children, I obviously was very happy to participate in that.
Lots of things to talk about, so stay with us. We'll be right back on One on One. Welcome back to One on One, where today we are joined by singer and performer Heather Katz. Heather, thank you for joining us today. We left off talking about some of the social initiatives that you had worked with, and you recorded a song in 1998 called The Wish, and that was for the Search for the Cure. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved with that.
Well, my dear friend Virgil Scott knew the guy that was going across Canada to raise money, and he called on all of his friends. And, you know, in the music business, it's a big, huge community, but it's really a small community. Yeah. And people that you've known over the years, you can call on them at any time. And we've seen this in a very big way with Live 8 and Live 8 and Live Earth. You know, you pick up the phone. If there's something important, people will be there. And it was the same thing with The Wish. It was on a much smaller scale. Virgil called people, said, you know, we're doing this song, and this guy is going across Canada, and we're going to get in the studio, and we'll be there. It was crowded, you know, and we did it very similarly to We Are the World, you know, where everybody took a section. And it was funny, Virgil told me years later he was playing it for someone, and he said, wow, you got Anne Murray in there. He says, no, that's Heather Katz.
That's great.
Oh, it's that deep, husky voice.
Well, you seem to surround yourself with these amazing communities of great musicians. So speaking of that, tell me a little bit about the Pomelos.
Oh, the Pomelos are myself and 4 other unbelievable women that I've known for varying lengths of time. The longest relationship in that for me is Marianne Gerard. We've been friends since I was in my mid-20s. Laura Bird is, I met her when I moved to the Orangeville area, an amazing songwriter and wonderful singer, a fabulous guitar player. And we heard recently that Catherine Wheatley had moved into the Guelph area. Tana Sliman lived there prior to that. And another friend of ours, Julia, had suggested that we all get together for tea.
Yeah.
And so Laura said, well, let's have it at my place. And we all got together and we had tea and chocolate, because you can't have 6 women together without chocolate. And many of us ended up with it on our noses and fingers, and that was a lot of fun.
That's great.
And during the course of the afternoon, we talked about how lovely it would be to all sing together. And that's often said.
Yeah.
But we decided that we really did want to sing together. And so we met again and threw some songs into the center and started to work on them. And, I must give Laura Bird a lot of credit for that, because she really initiated getting the gigs and, putting the calls out to the places that we played in the first year. We only had a couple of gigs in the first year. Following year, we did a 5-city tour, which included the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, which was a lot of fun.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was a great gig.
Well, we talked a little bit about the fact that you took a little bit of time off, but when you came back in 2003, that's when you did your CD called Tell Mama. Tell me a little bit about the making of that CD, what it meant to you, and also about the title.
When Christmas of 2003 was upon us, I sent out cards for the first time in a long time, and one was to my friend Virgil Scott, whom we've talked about before. And he called me sometime in January to thank me for the card, and he said something very strange to me. He said, we will never hear you on the radio. And I got very indignant. I said, what are you talking about? He says, well, we're never going to hear you on the radio because you don't have a CD.
Oh, wow.
And I said, well, I guess you're probably right about that. He says, you really need to make a CD. I said, well, it's something I've thought about for many, many years, but with my focus being on raising my family, I didn't really have the drive to put towards making a CD. And Virgil says, well, Heather, I really want you to have a CD, so I will give you 6 months of my time and all of my expertise, and we will get you a CD. And that's exactly what he did. And
how did that make you feel? Somebody just sort of saying this is how much it even means to them that you do this.
I really felt undeserving. Really? I have, they had it in the Toronto Star this week, a big article on Impostor Syndrome. There's a little part of me that always thinks that maybe they've made some kind of mistake. Maybe I really am not what people think I am. But it was pretty impressive, the people that came out to be on the CD, the work that Virgil put in, and Michael Fonfera, who's a dear, dear friend and amazing musician. They co-produced the CD. We did it over only 5 days in the studio, but then the post-production was much longer. I decided to call it Tell Mama for 2 reasons. Tell Mama was a song that I had put on the CD.
Okay.
It was a CD of songs that I took from many different genres over the years that I have loved. I didn't really focus on any one specific genre of music. And so it was quite eclectic. So Tell Mama was a song I always loved the way Etta James did.
Yeah.
And the reason I was able to make the CD was when my mother passed away in 2001, the inheritance that I got was such that it enabled me to make it. And
that's amazing.
She always wanted me to do that.
That's
and
wonderful.
It's unfortunate that it was her death that enabled me financially to do it.
Yeah.
But I felt that I had to dedicate it to her and dedicate it to my grandmother and the strength that I got from them.
That's amazing. Well, we're going to come back and continue to talk about your life here, your life with your family, and some of your influences. We'll be right back here with Heather Katz on One on One. Welcome back to this edition of One on One, where today we have the pleasure of talking to singer and performer Heather Katz. And Heather, you live in this area in Dufferin County. It's a beautiful area. Tell me why you decided to stay here, and if you find inspiration in the beauty of the area.
I remember when I was little, my mother had a furniture store when I was 12 or so, and she used to do a lot of antiquing in the Orangeville area, and that was the first time I'd ever been to the area. When I got married the first time and decided I wanted to have a family, I wanted to live in a place that I felt my children would be safe, and where I would have space, and if we wanted to have a dog or a pony, that I would be able to do that. And I started looking a lot in real estate magazines and found a property here. My first husband was in the restaurant business, so we also bought a restaurant in town, as well as a home.
Yeah.
And our daughter was born here, our first daughter. And I've lived several different places in Dufferin area. I've also lived up in Mulmer, just north of Highway 89, and then recently we've moved to East Scarifraxa. I really feel that although we've moved within the area, the community that I have in this area is very strong. There's a very big arts community. It's a very supportive community, and I do feel that my children are safe here. My husband and I were talking about whether if we won a lottery, what we would do, and he said, well, where would you want to live? I said, well, I'd want to live here.
Isn't that telling?
I said, but I just want to do all the work to the house that needs to be done.
Yeah. What do you love most about this area?
I love the fact that I can live in a home with a lot of space and a lot of space around me for the same amount of money that I could have a semi-detached home in Toronto. I love that there are several different organizations that support arts. There's the Orangeville Artists Association. There's HAMS, which I'm a member of, the Headwaters Acoustic Music Association. There's the Orangeville Concert Association, and it's safe here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other than music, what are you most passionate about?
I'm passionate about passion.
Wow.
I'm passionate about anything that moves you to the extent that it creates a well of life inside of you. I have been passionate about painting and do like to paint. I am passionate about my relationships with people, my family, but as well as other people in my life. I love my friends, and I like making new friends. I'm passionate about nature. I'm passionate about keeping nature healthy. And anything that just is part of life.
It has been such a pleasure talking to you. What does the future hold for you now, Heather?
Well, I'm starting to work a little more in the music business. My oldest daughter is 18 and going off to college. My 12-year-old daughter, Brianne, is a competitive dancer, so I'm still a taxi for her.
Still in the family business,
Still
I guess.
Exactly. But I'm getting calls from more people. I've got some concerts coming up. We've got a tour coming up again with the Pomelos in March. We are playing at the Opera House for International Women's Day, which is great. We've actually got the day for International Women's Day this year. Yeah, it doesn't always fall on an appropriate day to have the Opera House. And to continue with my painting, to continue with my music.
That's wonderful. Well, we're so looking forward to seeing more of your work and hearing more of your work as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather.
Thanks so much, Melissa.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us on this edition of One on One. I'm your host, Melissa Morris, and I'll see you next time.
One on One was taped on location at the Millcroft Inn and Spa, which features award-winning dining and accommodations and state-of-the-art European-style spa.